Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We have a number of issues we're going to talk about today in this episode of the podcast, and they all are kind of, fallout from the midterms, basically. Some more directly than others, but they all kind of, they're all in that ballpark. And one of those, as you know, we now have a special counsel who is going to be taking over the various investigations of President Donald Trump. I did a post about this right afterward, in which I basically said, "Hey, this is fine as far as I'm concerned. I don't see the problem," because I saw a lot of people saying, "Oh, the fix is in. This is like, the blue ribbon commission. They're just going to punt it." I don't see. I was mystified by those responses. Honestly, I'm basically in the same camp of those people who say, "Look, we're way too far into the space of." The most theoretical nominal conflict of interest. Automatically we got to bring someone in, bring someone else in. I mean, Joe Biden was elected president. He appointed a very apolitical attorney general. There's no problem here. So do I think it was necessary, like that it would be inappropriate if they didn't appoint someone like this? No, I don't really think it was necessary. But do I think it's a problem? No, I just do not see that. Now, I did see something. Uh, a legal commentator who I respect a lot. I saw, saying basically, well, this is going to, delays, and if the investigation goes into 2025, if it's a Republican president, they can shut the whole thing down. Um, First of all, there's a couple reasons why that doesn't make sense to me. And maybe I'm the one who's wrong, but this is my thinking, at least. The first is, as I understood what Merrick Garland said, this new guy is not coming in and like starting the investigation from scratch. I don't think they're not going to have to recover ground they've already covered. And at least my interpretation of that is he doesn't have to hire investigators and stuff like that, as we've seen in various ways in different investigations over the years. I don't think that's the case. I think there are investigators who are doing this, there are FBI agents who are doing this, and he is coming in to basically take Merrick Garland's position. There's some little nuances there, but basically that when they say, "Hey, we want to do this," we want to raid Mar-a-Lago, or we want to bring this indictment, that is the new guy is the one who's going to make those calls. Now, if I'm totally wrong about that, that might kind of change my opinion a little, but not that much. And I don't think I'm wrong about that. So that's kind of my take on that. We're going to discuss that, and sort of surrounding that, you had this week. This is like Donald Trump's hell week before judges. Basically, this is the every all these different investigations where he's been playing them out in this direction and that direction. They all kind of came to a head with judges at the state level, federal level, different appellate level, stuff like that, all kind of saying, "Dude, no, no, we're not doing that." And we're gonna talk to my co-host Kate about that. But I guess my sense is, in a lot of cases, it's just because he's been stringing things out, and now in a lot of these cases, they've got to the final judge, basically. So, like, you get a bad ruling and you say, "Fine, I'm going to appeal it to the next person." In a lot of cases, they've just gotten to the last person. It's kind of done, and maybe those people have put a little more kind of spin on the ball in their in their comments. But that is a big part of it. I also wonder, to a certain extent, judges are human beings, and Republican judges are even more human than most of us. Let's put it that way. Okay. And I suspect they can kind of, they see which way the wind is blowing. So I suspect that has made everybody kind of a little less scared of Donald Trump, a little maybe made people a little less willing to kind of throw him a lifeline. Because, I was talking about this in a post that these weren't necessarily the main issues that were coming to a head this week, but on the January 6th stuff, and the special prosecutor guy's taken that over, taking that, the Trump part of that over as well. There, at least, you've got some real legal questions. You know, there is not a there's not a clear cut like insurrection statute. I mean, there is actually an insurrection statute, but there's not a statute that necessarily directly addresses the exact set of facts that we saw in the lead up to January 6th and on January 6th. But in the stuff with Mar-a-Lago, it's just clear cut. He wasn't allowed to have that stuff. He knew he wasn't allowed to have that stuff. He took it. He lied about it. He hid it. It you know, it's he's just guilty as hell. And so we're going to see how that plays out. Now, the other thing that I am really interested in, fascinated by, in the sense of how it's fascinating when you drive by a horrific accident on the highway, is the situation with Kevin McCarthy. I just wrote a post, and the point of that post is basically saying, coming out of the midterm, in official Washington, the sort of the takeaway is, you know, MAGA and Donald Trump is just, toxic in a general election. People who go down that road, they lose elections that Republicans could otherwise win. And that's why we're seeing various Republicans, start making bids to kind of like, okay, maybe I can push Trump aside. DeSantis, all the other people. But if you look at the actual Republican Party, it's full steam ahead. I mean, it's Hunter Biden or bust. It's like, impeach the DHS secretary, impeach Tony Fauci, even though he's like retired now. So it's like everything. And you see that playing out because, I really want to hear from those reporters who in the fall were writing those source greaser articles about Kevin McCarthy. Like, oh man, Kevin's a ball buster, man. He's picked the lock of the House GOP caucus. He's got this thing. I mean, clearly he does not have this thing. And I noticed that one of our colleagues here at TPM just published a piece as we were prepping to record this episode. He's losing support. He is losing support. The kind of where this has stood is about 30 representatives did not vote for him in the caucus. Now, let's just remind ourselves kind of how this works. You become the party's nominee for speaker by winning a majority of the caucus. So you win 51% of the caucus, you're the nominee for speaker. But the way that this works is to be speaker, you have to get voted on by a majority of the whole House. Okay. When you have a very slender majority like this, that means you basically need unanimous support from your party. So you got those 30 people who wouldn't vote for him. So they didn't want him, but that doesn't mean they're going to vote against him, because normally that's like, you don't do that. At least as of yesterday, there were 4 House Republicans who basically said, I will never vote for Kevin McCarthy for speaker. So like, no way. So he's needed to kind of basically get everyone else. He can probably lose 4. I think that's where we are in terms of the size of their majority. There's even some other funny business they can do where they can get some Republicans to abstain. So that pulls the number down for what you need beneath 218. Okay. But remember, the Democrats have, I think now, 213 reps. So you can't have too many sustain. You can't have too many abstain, because then you have Hakeem Jeffries becoming speaker. So so McCarthy is out there kind of like on a national job interview, or kind of like on a, reality TV feats of strength episode. He's going down to the border, threatening to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas. He's he's going to kick like all the Democrats off every committee, and even with that, he's still losing support. So we're going to talk about how this is actually going to play out. Not that at least I don't know how it's going to play out. So, but before we do that, I want to remind you that Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee is a sponsor of the Josh Marshall podcast. If you're traveling for the holidays while you're packing up the kids, dogs, and sweaters for your annual visit to your in-laws' house, don't forget to pack Grady's Cold Brew kit, because without proper planning, drinking a single sip from your mother-in-law's moldy coffee pot will be even harder on your stomach than watching OANN over family dinner. Luckily, the Grady's Cold Brew kit makes it easy to drink delicious coffee on the go. Just toss in some bean bags, add water, stick the pouch in the fridge overnight. You'll have smooth, flavorful coffee all week long. Ready to give it a swirl? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, Kate Riga, what's going on?
Yeah, so let's kind of start in the Trump Hell Week corner. You led off with the special prosecutor, which is so funny because it almost feels that if we hadn't been so inundated with like special/independent counsels of various stripes of late, it would have been, big juicy news, even just because the phrase special prosecutor is like kind of exciting,
Yeah, it's kind of it like kind of not a thrill. What's that thing, like a frisson, right? Kind of it gets everybody a little stirred up.
But now it was just like your kind of mandatory headlines about it, and then people just kind of like Googling who this guy is. And I don't know what your immediate impression was, but when I saw the news, I was just kind of like so shrug about it, because I kind of feel that the biggest criticism I've seen coming from, like, I don't know, Lawrence Tribe and those like that, is that the biggest consideration here at this point is time. The idea being that if Republicans perform really well in 2024 and kind of like take over the government, or at least enough of it, that this investigation would be dismantled. And I think that's, pretty unimpeachably true. And then the concern being that you've got this new guy, he's got to hire staff, he's got to get offices, he's got to get up to speed, etc. And
is that your impression though, on that key point, that he really, I mean, obviously he's going to need to hire a few people just to like, assistance to him, but does he actually have to hire like an investigative team? Because my assumption is like the team is there.
Right.
He's
That's
just
my
the new
understanding
boss.
too.
Yeah.
He's just kind of taking over things. So in that way, I thought it was like, I hear what they're saying, but I don't necessarily know that I feel this is automatically like a 3-month time suck of getting this guy up to speed. But on the other hand, I was just kind of left feeling like, okay, why? Like, why do they need this guy in the first place? And kind of best I can understand is, we don't want it to appear political. This is a big deal, so we want to outsource it to this guy. And on that grounds, I'm just kind of like, that to me feels like we're operating in an earlier political age, because the idea that if Garland, who is himself, in all but the most brainworm chewed minds, like a cautious to a fault, kind of careful, centrist, bland man, this idea that, well, we're going to bring in someone else and we're going to give him the authority, and then Republicans will be like, you know what, that's fair, he's a straight shooter, nothing we can say. Like, come on, that's not going to happen. Like,
Right,
they're
right.
they're going to either find some connect, like Jack Smith is going to be connected to someone who once like was in college Democrats or something, and that'll be enough. Or the truth of the matter is that the attorney general can basically take or leave whatever the special prosecutor comes out with. So it's not like the independence is kind of this huge, Garland can't touch it kind of thing. So either way, this idea of like, well, we're outsourcing it to kind of keep it non-political strikes me as just a little silly and a little bit of a solution crafted for a time we're not in. I don't think he could have handed this investigation over to anyone who Republicans wouldn't have been like, witch hunt, political
Totally,
persecution.
totally. I
So
mean,
it's just kind of like, just charge ahead, just do the thing, you know?
yeah, I mean, I noticed that uh, they're right out of the gate. I can't remember this guy's name. He's one of the guys who basically was like kind of one of the top enforcers on the Republican side on the Judiciary Committee for years. So, kind of
Mhm.
why do we have a stacked judiciary? This guy, right? He's kind of run that stuff. And he brought out that I guess, oh God, I'm forgetting. I think it's McDonnell, this guy who was the last Republican governor of Virginia. Um, I can't remember his first name. In any case, he was indicted and convicted. Uh, it's not technically bribery. It's this kind of, what is it, like false. Basically, this idea is someone gives you some money and then you do some stuff in policy terms. You are cheating. Bob McDonnell, thank you. You're sort of cheating the public of honest services, like doing your job the right way. Okay,
Okay.
that conviction was overturned. I think it was unanimously by the Supreme Court. So like not on a kind of on a Republican Democrat divided thing. And that decision has had very big repercussions in public corruption cases over the last decade, because it's that was the way. If a politician is in office and some donor type is like giving him a car and sending him sports tickets and all sorts of stuff, and he's doing stuff for him, that's how you charge that person. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. That is not that whole theory is not okay. So it's kind of blown this hole open in how we approach public corruption cases. And so that's a big deal in itself. But their thing is like, so I guess the point is that was when uh this Smith guy was the head of the public corruption division. And so ergo, he tried to take out a rising Republican, and even the Democrats on the Supreme Court shot him down because as you say, they're going to find anything. And it does kind of seem antiquated, or maybe not antiquated, but just outdated. Like
Mhm.
we're in a different era, and at a basic level, we should believe in democratic accountability. The public elected Joe Biden to run the executive branch. Joe Biden made the decision to put Merrick Garland to run the Justice Department. In point of fact, he is a former judge. He has basically no partisan profile, although, he was appointed by Democrats. So he's kind of in the Democratic camp, but he's not a partisan in any sense. And so, you know, if Donald Trump committed a crime, they should prosecute him. It's just we get into this appearances of impropriety and appearances of conflict when there's actually no conflict. And I guess how it was explained to me, or some commentary I saw, is that I guess the current special prosecutor statute, or I can't remember if it's a statute or DOJ regs, basically says you do it if there's a conflict, or if the case has just such public importance. If it's such a big deal, it just kind of makes sense. And it seems like it's in that bucket. And it is a big deal. We've never prosecuted a former president, so it's a big deal. So, yeah, it does seem needless to me. On the other hand, I okay, whatever.
Exactly.
I don't think it's going to if Donald Trump is going to be indicted, it should not be over a close call. You don't indict a former president if it's kind of like right on the edge. That doesn't make sense. It's going to have to be something that kind of like, dude, you committed a crime. And just because you're like ranting on Truth Social, we're not going to say that's okay. And at least in the Mar-a-Lago case, I think that's where we are. And this guy seems like a pretty big hard ass. So, I mean, and more generally, I guess my question was more, I mean, I think we knew this, but what has kind of hovered over the Mar-a-Lago investigation the whole time is, are they really looking to indict him? Or is this kind of like, look, the government wants his documents back. He was being a dick about it. So they kind of had no choice but to go and get them. And, so the point is, they're not really indicting Donald Trump has never really been what this is about. It's kind of an administrative action. Well, I don't think you appoint a special prosecutor if that's what's happening. I think you appoint a special prosecutor if this is an investigation leading towards an indictment. It is structured around indicting the person who did the bad stuff. That doesn't mean it will necessarily happen, but that's a certain kind of investigation. And I think it is that kind of investigation. And if you're just wrapping it up, no one's gonna. Well, I'm not even sure that's 100% the case. If you're just wrapping it up, there's no real need to do this. I think you do this because there's a big decision coming up, and you're just trying to kind of put a bow on it and get out of the way.
I mean, I think in terms of the profile that Smith is taking over, you've got the January 6th stuff on the one hand, which I think it's almost hard for people to swallow the fact that it's not open and shut, because everyone with eyes and ears is kind of like, this is his fault. But that's, obviously not quite enough to indict,
Right.
along the
Right.
lines of these statutes. But the Mar-a-Lago one is just so much less of like a hydra. There's so many less pieces. Like, it really boils down to the fact that, like, you cannot be light fingered with these kind of documents. And it wasn't a case of him, whoops, I forgot to return it. It was a case that the National Archives badgered him for a long time, gave him like a lot of leeway to get this stuff back. And he was, delay. Then he's like, okay, fine, here's the stuff. And they're like, we know this isn't all the stuff. And then they get the FBI on board, and, lo and behold, there is serious classified documents there. And this is kind of a good segue into the oral arguments yesterday, because it's so basic. And the Trump team has such just piss poor defense here, which is why yesterday's oral arguments is a panel of judges from the 11th Circuit. It's 2 Trump appointees and 1 George W. Bush appointee. And they freaking tore the Trump lawyer apart. And it's because, this case, the Trump team kind of started out being like, this is attorney-client privilege, man. And then this is executive privilege. And that was kind of the whole basis of the special master nonsense that was only greenlit because you got this like OAN judge to be like, yeah, makes sense. And so they got the special master on those claims. Those grounds have been all but abandoned. They have not been mentioned in the latest Trump briefs. They've since kind of switched to, you know what, actually, this was a matter of presidential versus personal designation. And Trump designated these documents as personal in his mind. So there is nothing you can do about that. You got to go back and challenge the designation kind of thing. And then they've also kind of left that. And now, hours, really just minutes before the oral arguments began, they filed another document back in that district court with the super Trumpy judge saying, we need the affidavit that was underlying the search warrant, because we think that this raid, this ransacking was done improperly and it was political. And we need to basically see what the agents were kind of allowed to do in the affidavit to prove that Trump's rights were trampled during the search. So this has only been going on for like a couple months. And that is the complete evolution that Trump's legal team has taken since then. And so yesterday, you almost feel bad for the guy. You have Trump's lawyer up there kind of like dancing around, trying to be like, every time they would ask him a specific question, it was so funny. At the beginning, every judge was like, was there something improper about the seizure? Because why else in the world are you trying to get us involved at this stage in the investigation before there's an indictment, before there's like any appeal stuff? Like, why are we even here? And then the guy would just be like, well, it's the broad scope of the matter. And like, they took his Celine Dion picture. And the judges were like, tell us something was wrong with the raid, or else there's nothing we can do here.
So I want you to focus on this part, or explain for our listeners on this point, because
Mhm.
as I understand it, and I have not been following this as close, the precise details as closely as you have, that one of the sort of prongs here is that judges would say, look, when you get indicted or when they try to put you in jail, that then you might come back and say,
Mhm.
hey, I need that document. You cannot use that document against me because you took it in ways that are improper, blah 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 blah. Some constitutional clear constitutional issues. But as I understand it, the judges are basically saying, we're not there yet. You're trying to literally go inside the executive branch and govern how they make decisions inside the executive branch that for the moment have nothing to do with you.
Exactly. So it all kind of it hangs on this idea. There are these like factors that you apply to a search. And the big one is if there was uh callous disregard of the rights involved. And that's kind of the thing where you say, they broke the law in gathering the evidence, right? So then there's like something to contest there, and perhaps they wouldn't be able to use the evidence. And the thing is, even this Trumpy lower court judge, she said that Trump wins on some of these other factors, these kind of like lower level factors, but that first one, the callous disregard, even she said that the government didn't do that, didn't violate his rights. And there was some contesting this in the oral arguments, but like the theory is kind of that factor matters the most, and if you don't have that one, none of the rest really matter. So that's why they were kind of pushing on this so hard during oral arguments. And the chief judge who was on the panel was like, well, if there was no improper seizure, what are we doing here? Because that's kind of the only reason you would need to involve the courts at this point. Because as you say, Trump has not yet been charged with anything. The government hasn't even been allowed to investigate anything yet. So Trump's team is just kind of doing this thing of like trying to throw spaghetti at the wall, enabled by this lower court judge, in the hopes it honestly seems like just to slow down the investigation enough until they can kind of get
Come up
into
with a new theory.
power, figure
Yeah,
out
yeah.
some way to kind of defeat it, because I mean, here they're going to such lengths as saying that the classified documents that were found were not in fact confidential information. They were wrongly designated as classified. Like they're trying to fight over every granular little piece of this, which is why it's almost as cathartic as it kind of was to hear these Republican judges be like, you're an idiot, basically. This whole exercise is just pointless. It's born out of this a special master decision that no sane judge ever would have made. Because and part of her biggest argument for letting there be a special master is Trump's Trump's persona could take such hits from an indictment that we need to
Yeah,
be
what was that quote
careful.
she had? It's like a whole other ball game, or like she had some kind of like throwaway comment. And obviously, judges can have flourishes, but she actually seemed to be making it like that was like a legal prong of her argument. Like it's Trump, man, and his. So let me make sure I
Mhm.
understand this. So hopefully our listeners understand this. So basically, you have two buckets, and one bucket would be to say, in terms of this search, one bucket would be to say the judges look at it and say this entire thing was bullshit. You had no basis for searching this guy's premises. The whole thing is wrong. So we're throwing it out. Give the stuff back. We're done. Versus, okay, you went through you got a warrant, you did all the stuff, you have the stuff, and so now you have the stuff, and you guys over the Justice Department can look at it and talk about it and do, kind of that's your business. Now, when you come to indict Donald Trump, if you do, then we'll have to go through and Trump's lawyers will be able to say, you can't allow this document to be admissible for X, Y, and Z reason. And then you've got a whole different standard about whether or not it is admissible, constitutional standards. And basically the judge is saying the first part is just it's just get out of here. And since he's not indicted, all this is like irrelevant.
Exactly. I mean, and the Trump team only even started to try to make that first case yesterday, basically. Like, that was kind of this is the first time they're really going after, like, the warrant and the search itself, other than just some, like, generalized griping of, like, "This isn't how you treat our king," kind of thing. But the chief judge on the panel said, "Think of the extraordinary nature from our perspective. An injunction against the executive branch in a pre indictment situation. Under the separation of powers, the judiciary does not interfere with those kinds of prosecutorial and investigatorial decisions." So, I mean, it's
So that's really
exactly
at the
like you
heart of it.
say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's like this is a huge separation of powers problem. And imagine if the courts did kind of let Trump just stymie the investigation before, if the investigation even happened. I mean, and they said this during yesterday's hearings too, that would just, open the door for anyone who's ever a target of a federal criminal investigation to just shop around for a friendly district court and be like, no, 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 we need a special master, or like, I designated these all unclassified with my mind, so sorry, you're out of luck.
Right, right. Well, I guess it does remind us, or at least it reminds me, kind of where does the judiciary fit in all of this? And I think the point here is the judiciary does not tell the federal government how to be the federal government. It
Hmm.
comes in when there is some party who says, I'm getting screwed with and it's not fair. And it's not fair because I have this right under the Constitution. And so I'm going to go into a court and say, this isn't okay. And when that happens is when some person has a is claiming to be injured. And until you're indicted, it it doesn't matter to Donald Trump what they're talking about in the Justice Department, unless,
Right.
until his liberty or his money or whatever gets involved. So anyway, okay, so basically these three Republican appointed judges, two of whom actually appointed by Trump himself, basically just like drop kicked the lawyers to like oblivion, and now it it seems very clear they're going to shut this whole thing down. And I guess it's just a question of like, does it happen this afternoon, or do they kind of go,
Right.
go a little slower?
Yeah, and we kind of knew the outcome before because the government already had a win on the classified documents involved, where a different panel from the same circuit, but with two of the same judges that were on the oral arguments, basically let the government, use the classified documents in their investigation and kept them out of the purview of the special master, who's like still, poor guy, sifting through for these like executive privilege claims that the Trump team isn't even really making anymore. So we kind of already had an indication that this is probably like the friendliest panel Trump could have picked. And they're like, this is ridiculous. So things were not looking great for him. And they also already tried to appeal that classified documents decision up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was like, no, thank you. So things are not looking good for Team Trump at this juncture.
Well, it's interesting too that you have. I mean, I think one question in the Supreme Court's next term, I think, will be, the politics. This, well, we know this is a very political Supreme Court, but this election outcome, I think, has to feel like some level of the public sending a message to the Supreme Court. Not that they're going to say, "Oh, okay, we got to be liberal now," but like, how far do you push stuff, kind of stuff. But it also, and there has long been this question of, they have their, conservative judicial agenda. They have the sort of overriding authority of the president when it's a Republican,
Hmm.
another big agenda point. But there's been this lingering question of, when Donald Trump's a private citizen and in trouble for something he totally didn't have to do, are they really going to like, do they give a shit? Like, do they really like, oh man, I, Donald Trump's our guy, so we need to help him out of this kind of ridiculous, this problem he made for himself. And in this case, it seems like, the law is clear cut enough that, there's not much of a bone to throw him. But at some point, that's probably going to start coming into the picture that they're kind of like, we never liked this guy to start with. He was like really fucking useful, but like, fuck this guy. Why are we gonna like, like play chits to help him?
I also think it's just like a quantity problem, right? I
Right.
mean, maybe if the idea was like, we will help him out, pay him back for loading the court for, the next 50 years, but that's an every week kind of obligation. So
Exactly. Like maybe we'll cut you a little, we're gonna like run some interference for you on the taxes stuff. Maybe we're gonna do some like give you some executive privilege help. Maybe we'll even kind of like overlook the January 6th stuff, but like, dude, you know, why did this latest thing? And that is kind of the I mean, even Trump has such a bizarre gravitational field. Like even I'm kind of saying, well, sometimes you do need to have an insurrection if you don't want to leave office, kind of like, but it's obviously I don't think that, but the document stuff is, I'm sure the judges are like, dude, why?
I
Like,
know.
we know why you did the insurrection. You can't do that, but like, at least we understand what was going on. You didn't want to admit you lost, but like, you also took all the stuff down to your hotel. I mean, what?
And it's such that classic vintage Trumpian combination of like malice in terms of, degrading norms and having no respect for the institutions and everything, and just buffoonery where you're like, it, far as we can tell, this stuff was just kind of like crammed into drawers alongside signed golf balls. Like, was that worth it for you to potentially go down? I mean, which is so Trump, right? That he had the opportunity to just give him the stuff back and it wouldn't have mattered. But now he's looking at all this improper handling of classified documents, and you open up the whole floodgates of like, even though Trump is, an idiot, there are people in his orbit who know about his idiocy and take advantage of that. And then you're left wondering who opened those drawers, who popped by Mar-a-Lago to see what they could find.
Well, that's the thing that really makes me think there will be indictments over this, is that, as you say, he could have, like a year ago, he could have said, oh, sorry, didn't know those weren't mine, or didn't know they got, and I have no doubt that the Biden administration, or really any administration, if on the first request you say, oh, dude, so sorry, sending them right back, you're not going to indict former president over that.
Right.
Maybe you should, but you're not going to. But in this case, his pleadings in the investigation, he's still saying they're his.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's not even getting like, well, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, and I didn't, whatever. He's saying they're still his. That's his defense. And I don't see how you can not vindicate the law just to make the point, no, they're really not yours, dude. And so that, I think, I've never been a prosecutor. I don't know exactly how they think, but it's not just a question of like, well, he hasn't shown remorse. He still says they're his, and that just can't stand.
Totally. I mean, we're talking in the Garland context, right, about the idea of the appearance of political impropriety and why it's important to kind of close that off at the bud. But here, I mean, if Trump is not indicted for the document stuff, that is just saying that these document laws don't matter, that the handling of classified documents doesn't matter. And like, the tranche of people in the past who have been indicted for that will probably be like, what the fuck? But it's clear cut.
Yeah.
He had the chance to give them back. He was like implored to give them back. He pushed it to the point that they finally needed to do a raid, just because after he gave stuff back, they were like, we know this is not all of it. I mean, it's the kind of thing where I understand why they're skittish about prosecuting a former president. I would add that I don't think any restraint on, from a Democratic administration is going to have any bearing on the lack of restraint from a future Republican administration, should they be given this kind of chance. And in that way, it almost reminds me of like the filibuster parallel in the Senate, this just completely Looney Tunes idea that if Democrats don't get rid of the filibuster, well, then Republicans will follow their example. It's like, I don't know what that's based on, but here it's just, I know that it makes people twitchy and it makes people nervous, but it's open and shut. You
Yeah.
got to do it. Okay.
Agreed. So what about so what about Kevin McCarthy?
What
We went
about Kevin, our
yeah. So
Kevin?
what's the latest here? Because it's funny. Just as I did a post today, basically saying kind of what we said at the beginning, kind of like there's all this stuff like, oh, MAGA's over. It's they're going to move away from it, when in fact in the House it's clearly, as we said, full steam ahead. And then a guy I know who's sort of like a dissident Republican, sort of, basically told me in an email, like, I think you're missing the fact that you've got these, vulnerable new Republicans from New York State, New Jersey, California. They're not going to stand for this stuff. And, my thought is like, dude, what planet are you living on? Like, because this person has, been everywhere in the GOP,
Mm-hmm.
but like, is there some universe that I have not visited where a bunch of sort of like soft soaps from New York State get up and say, huh, Jim Jordan, I'm afraid not, my friend. Sit right down. We're
Put
going to
on
go
a
about this
coat, brother.
in a bipartisan way. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that it is going to be I think it is going to be unbelievably contentious, because I do think those people are going to be saying, I'm going to lose my seat in 2 years. Like, I may lose my seat regardless. We kind of got lucky in a bunch of those, in a bunch of those races. But, that's just not how it goes in that world. But I'm sort of, I really did not believe there was any chance that he would not become speaker. Now I'm a little less sure. But the issue is, who else is going to be speaker?
Right. I mean, that's the thing. And kind of how you were outlining how the leadership elections work at the beginning. It's not just a matter of numbers at a flat line that don't change, right? Like, if, like you say, people vote present, people vote weird protest votes, like vote for Joe Biden for speaker or whatever. That just like takes the numbers down. That makes it easier for him to get his majority. I honestly, it's hard for me to see a world where he doesn't become leader or speaker, not least because we've had elections in the past where people have not been able to get majorities, and so a plurality kind of settles it. And I think,
Well, but I don't think a plurality does here, does it? Like, you can abstain, and that brings the number of the majority down, but they're bound by the number of Democrats. So they can, at least as I'm understanding this, they can bring it down from, like, I think now it's 222 to 213. Let's assume for the moment that's
yeah,
the final number. Okay. So they can bring the necessary number down from 218 to 214. They can't bring it to 213 because presumably all the Democrats are voting for Hakeem Jeffries. So that's the kind of the wiggle room they have. So that means, again, if I'm thinking about this the right way, that means they can lose 6 votes, which that's I mean, for our listeners, I mean, again, what this comes down to is, who else are they going to get? And that, I think, I mean, there's kind of 2 questions. There's 2 answers to that. But Kate, you were going to say something.
Oh, I know. I was just going to add the Philip Bump at the Post wrote kind of a piece outlining the weird math, and he's the one who kind of added here that there have been occasions where the House didn't reach an agreement on speaker, so they allowed a plurality of cast votes to determine it. That hasn't happened in like super recent history.
Oh, so okay, so I guess what that must mean is that they can do a separate vote to change the rules for how they
Right.
elect a speaker.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, and that okay.
But I think you and I agree that the end point is almost certainly McCarthy becomes speaker, because there just doesn't seem to be, like you say, a second choice.
Well, it's something just occurred to me, though.
Mm-hmm.
It's still kind of the same difference, because, like, okay, fine, you don't need a majority, but you still need more than 213, because Hakeem Jeffries has 213 votes. So even if you change it from that, I'm not sure if that, I mean, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm not thinking about this the right way, but I think it's kind of the same difference with people abstaining because again, he has to get more than 213 votes.
I mean, a lot of it is ultimately going to come down to how these people express their opposition. Right now we've got like 5 people who say to varying degrees that they're not going to vote for McCarthy, and some of them have left themselves more wiggle room than others.
Right. Okay.
But I think the thing is, like, we had the newest guy said, "I'm a hard no, I'm going to vote no. I'm not going to vote present. I'm not going to vote, for Ronald Reagan. I'm going to vote no," kind of thing. Um, and that's going to end up being critical, right? Because that's a big part of what we're talking about, the present versus like taking the numbers down or voting for someone else versus voting no. That's a
Right.
different vote.
Right.
um
Right.
and so I think that's something that we don't totally know yet, if these, like, they're all Freedom Caucus or Freedom Caucus adjacent, if they're making this noise right now to get concessions from McCarthy and to make sure that he basically lets the Freedom Caucus run the group, but he's just kind of like, in charge in name. If they're
Right.
trying to do that, if they're trying to just get caught protesting, I don't think it's like totally clear yet how purposeful this opposition is.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like, what is their beef with Kevin McCarthy? They have no beef with Kevin McCarthy. And I don't mean by that like they have no beef that like Josh recognizes. They have no beef with him. He has been accommodating in every conceivable way. So this whole exercise is whether it's about specific concessions or not, it's fundamentally about we want to show him who is boss. We want to basically make him beg and crawl over crushed glass to get this, and that we are in charge. And I think there's no question that is what it's about. I think the only question is whether they are now so caught up in the excitement that they themselves cannot rein it in.
Right.
Because the problem for them is that no one is going to be more accommodating to them.
Mm-hmm.
No one is going to be more accommodating than Kevin McCarthy is being. Now, you could, put up Jim Jordan or like Paul Gosar or I guess Mo Brooks retired, but someone like that. Then I think you'd have a pretty hard time getting those people from getting the other side, everybody to come along. So I think the only real alternative is you get someone who is it McHenry? There's one person they talk about a lot. Just someone who's kind of like a backslapping guy who doesn't have any kind of profile or any juice, and everybody kind of likes him. And you figure, okay, he'll just be a figurehead. And why is that any better than McCarthy? Well, we'll have McCarthy's scalp, and that
Mm-hmm.
will be good for us. But that's not really, there are downsides to doing that. But again, for our listeners, the way to see this 100% is they want him to beg. They want to say dance, and he will dance, and that shapes his speakership. That he is, kind of they've cut both of his Achilles heels, and he's just there to kind of do their bidding. And again, the only way he doesn't become speaker isn't because that was really the strategy. It's because they just got into such a into such a frenzy they couldn't
Mm-hmm.
help it, kind of, and it spun out
Right.
of control.
Yeah, because I mean, like you say, there's why bother recruiting someone who's not Kevin? He's gonna do exactly what they want. He's already doing what they
Yeah,
want. Just in these past like couple weeks of agitating from the hard right of the caucus, he went down to the border and he's like, Mayorkas, resign or we're gonna have your head, and then he is now talking about getting Swalwell and Schiff and Ilhan
Omar,
Omar
yeah.
off their committees, stripping them of their committees. I mean, it's all going according to plan, right? So, I mean, fundamentally, it's not as if McCarthy was ever going to be like, you know what, guys, that's not right. That's not what we're here for. I mean, come on. Like, we watched how in his uber limited power these past couple years, basically, like, all we've seen him do is let Marjorie Taylor Greene, kind of daydream about like genociding various populations and be like, not good, my friend. And that is the long
And
and the
and
short
it's
of it.
important for our listeners to know that she is one of his biggest allies now. He is his whole thing right now is relying on Green and Jim Jordan. And these people are no more moderate and sane than any of the people who are threatening to vote against him. They've just made the decision, the strategic decision that they are going to get what they want by being his heat shields,
Hmm.
basically. So really what you have is a battle between literally Marjorie Greene and Matt Gaetz over over Kevin or not. Do we Marjorie wants to make Kevin the rug in the room they're sharing, and Matt says no, I want a different rug. So that's kind of what this is
Or
all about.
even, okay, I'll accede to the rug at some point, but right now reporters are really eager to talk to me because I'm being difficult about this. So I'm going to keep doing this for a little bit and then we can bring in the rug.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly
So the
right.
other thing I wanted to mention, especially in light of one of the myriad mass shootings we've had in the past few days, is that the same sex marriage bill, which has been kind of percolating in the Senate for a while, is finally on the glide path to passage. Last week, it overcame the first filibuster point with 2 votes to spare. So it's kind of clear that it's going to pass. They were going to vote on it in September, but Schumer booted it, hearing that Republicans were afraid of alienating their voters and that it had a greater path to pass in the lame duck. So that's kind of where we are now. Um, it's kind of it was emotional to watch, I think, because you had Tammy Baldwin, who is the first openly gay woman elected to both the House and the Senate, kind of putting this on her shoulders and shepherding it through. And it's funny, on the House floor, while you had all these people chatting and hobnobbing and everything, she was just most of it sitting by herself with a list, kind of watching the door and ticking off names to make sure that everyone was voting the way she thought they would. um but and there's been some back and forth over the content of the bill, especially because it keeps being described as codifying Obergefell, and that's not what it is. Obergefell both said that every state has to respect licenses that are granted in other states, and that every state has to grant same-sex licenses. This bill only does that first part. You have to recognize them. But if Obergefell were to be overturned and this law was the backstop, uh, states could bring back same-sex marriage bans, and it could be something like the abortion landscape, where you would have to travel to a non-hostile state.
Though in this case, it's obviously marriage is literally a different thing than an abortion. But so that if you're from
Yeah.
Alabama, if you live in Alabama, you would have to go to New York or wherever it is. But then when you come back to Alabama, Alabama has to treat your marriage as a totally on equal terms. So that obviously many couples live in one state and were married in a different state, and it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
It's not like it's not like a driver's license. You got to relicense in your own state. So, but that is it's a it is both a big symbolic difference, but also a big real difference. If you have to travel 500 miles to get married, that's not just a kind of a sort of a denigration of your equality. It's a big hassle.
Yeah. And the other thing that it does, which is important, is it repeals the
Defense of Marriage Act.
I was forgetting the D
Yeah,
word.
DOMA.
Uh,
DOMA.
DOMA, yeah. It repeals DOMA, which is unconstitutional for now, but is still on the books. And DOMA describes marriage as between a man and a woman and lets states not recognize same-sex marriages granted elsewhere. So basically, the sum total is like I understand people who are upset that this law wouldn't go as far as the Supreme Court ruling. I also think there are some legal reasons in terms of like what the government can tell states to do that makes this law more bulletproof than
Yeah.
one that tried to mirror Obergefell completely. And also just, I also saw a lot of people being like, I can't believe it's 2022 and only 12 Republicans voted for this. Totally understand that sentiment as well. However, 12 Republicans did vote for it, and it's going to pass, and Biden's going to sign it, and that is going to be I think it's really important to have that backstop in place, especially given
Yeah,
the
no,
clear hunger from at least Thomas to,
it's
you
a
know,
big it is a big deal. I mean, it's not, obviously it doesn't affect me, so I would, I defer to people who are affected by it. But the reality is that without it, you could be in a situation where, again, if you live in Alabama, if you live in Mississippi, if you live in Idaho, lots of states, that you will no longer be married in those, in the eyes of those states, and all the different things that you know that that come from that. That is a big, big deal. And at least while this creates a a kind of a denigration of the equality of gay and lesbian people, and creates a major hassle for having to travel to get married, it at least does backstop that once you do that, you will be able to go back to any state in the country and be fully married. And that is, that's bulletproof. So it's not nothing.
exactly, especially during this time of, I mentioned the shooting in the gay club, but the stage was really set by that, by the hard right just leaning so far into LGBTQ demonization, particularly with a special fervor for trans people, but really across the board, doing the age old, you know, gay pedophile associations that we've seen. I mean, that is old, and saying, groomers hurting children. And, Josh, you were mentioning at the top that you were even surprised how quickly, the Tucker Carlsons of the world kind of fell back on that, even in the immediate wake of a shooting where innocent people were murdered.
Yeah, they were basically a number of, I'm not even sure you'd by in present standards if you'd say far right, but people like Tucker Carlson and others basically saying, hey, you can't shoot people. There shouldn't have been this mass shooting. But what are we going to do about these grooming events, which basically just a gay club is a grooming event? Or the fact that, I guess, what is it? I think in this particular, I mean, not that it matters, but in this particular case, there was going to be a kind of, drag event the next day, the next morning. I guess it would have been Sunday morning at this club, because this is, I believe it's maybe Trans Month of Remembrance, or Day of it is a commemoration day to honor people who have died because they're trans, violence against trans people. Okay. So on the right, that is a grooming event, i.e., that, I mean, and so you do have a lot of people saying, hey, shooting people's not the right way to do it, but clearly we've got to end these, we've got to put a stop to this. So in, not even in essence saying he went about this the wrong way, but we can certainly understand what motivated him. I mean, which is, and it's this very it's this very strange thing, because I think we all know that one of the great transformations of the last generation is the dramatic change in the acceptance of gay and lesbian people and their basic bundle of rights in our society. In 2004, George W. Bush, to a great extent, won re-election on the basis of opposition to gay marriage. Now it is treated like, why are we even talking about it? I mean, obviously that's the case. You get a lot of Republicans to vote for it. And so you have this total transformation, and yet kind of through this back door, you've had it go dramatically in the other direction. And the sort of the path there is through controversies and demonization of trans people, and trans women in sports and pronouns and all these kind of hot button issues. That's been kind of that has been the path. And I think we know these remain controversial issues in American life, but it over the last 2 years, it has not only led to this vast demonization of trans people, but it has led to a new level of demonization of all LGBTQ people. And so it's this weird thing. It's kind of like all gone back in this different direction, where, I mean, we saw it in like in that law in Florida. It's not just trans stuff. It's kind of like, if you are even acknowledging that gay people exist in I can't remember if it's elementary school or whatever, that's grooming, i.e., so you're creating this framework where teachers are, again, in this world they've created, teachers are recruiting young children, sexualizing them to prep them to become gay.
Which is so old, right? I mean, that's
very, very, very old.
The fundamental thing that I am not clear on here is whether this is some kind of backlash, to, I don't know, the idea of progression in general, just an expression from people who feel like they're losing their place atop the social hierarchy or whatever, or if this stuff has just been kind of latent and there, even amidst the kind of broader landscape of huge advancement of acceptance of gay rights. And now that faction has just been so taken over the Republican Party that now we just hear about it all the time. Whereas before, you would only hear about it if you were kind of like seeking out those kind of homophobic message boards or something.
I don't know exactly. And I do think that I think at some level, there's an element of it that there are a lot of people who you say, hey, that couple down the street, those two men who live, who live in that house, can they get married? You're sort of like, whatever, I don't care what they do, fine. But then you get to like, should we explain to children that some people fall in love with, have sex with, get married to people of their own gender? I think you're in a different, for a lot of people, their comfort level with that is just not the same. So I think that's one dimension of this. I think I think another thing, though, that is not talked about a lot is, we know back to like Pizzagate and all these different conspiracy theories going back into the early Trump years, and even in some cases kind of predating it, this whole thing, Hillary Clinton runs a pedophile ring. All this kind of stuff. And there's a pizza joint in DC, and that's where they have the kids in the basement. All this kind of like totally insane stuff. I think there is a strong sense in which there's only a certain number of people in that world who are going to say, yeah, Tony Fauci and Hillary Clinton, they capture kids, from Idaho and they bring them to gay sex dungeons in New York, you're like, dude, what are you talking about? But when you say, well, no, they are grooming kids and it is pedophilia, I think part of this is a way to make that impulse, whatever was driving the kind of Democrats are running pedophile rings, to reshape it a little so that in a factual sense, it's more plausible, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not saying they're kidnapping kids in Idaho. They're saying that the Democrats have teachers teaching your kids stuff to get them ready to become trans or become gay. So I think that is a big part of it that no one kind of really wants to talk about, that a lot of it is sort of like the normalization of QAnon.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
it's all these things, and just where it comes from, who knows? But I think it's important for, I mean, you know, uh, 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 gays, lesbians know this is happening, but I do think there's a lot of our society doesn't quite get how far this has gone in the last year or two.
And to some degree, it's probably kind of riding the coattails of the critical race theory stuff as well,
Yep.
which proved to be a very, a potent talking point, even though it was completely made up, but also stems around this right wing discomfort with teaching children about the realities of racism and the legacy of slavery. And that that proved to be something that was emotionally poignant for
Hmm.
the target audience they're trying to reach. And I think you're totally right. Now it's just an expansion of that idea with the Q influence, with just really kind of the baseline of the Republican Party, this idea that it's much more palatable for people to take in these like bigoted ideas when it's predicated on we're just protecting the children.
Hmm.
That's a
Hmm.
way to kind of like whitewash the anti-black people and the anti-gay people stuff. So yeah, I mean it's all intertwined in a horrible way, which clearly, again, this stuff has real life consequences, and,
Hmm.
and we talked
Hmm.
about this with the Paul Pelosi attack, but I think it's still hard for a lot of like large media outlets to place the culpability where it belongs on this stuff. But this kind of speech has always been used to prime the ground for violence and to
Yeah.
teach people that these people are, subhuman and that they're dangerous and that they're preying on children. So violence against them is not only okay, but it's justified.
Yeah. It's defensive.
Yep. Okay, so let's move into a couple questions. This one is from Lauren. She says, now that Trump has announced his candidacy, what do you think will happen with the usual nomination primary process? I would think that Trump would try to bully Ronna McDaniel and the whole GOP apparatus into backing him as the quote unquote incumbent candidate without the need to do a primary process. How do you think this will play out? I think this is such a fascinating question because, especially on the heels of the reddening of Florida and DeSantis' success there, that's what we keep hearing about, right? Like DeSantis versus Trump. And it's almost, as much as either of those options would be obviously horrific for democracy and would be like hugely important for the Democrat Biden or whoever it is to defeat them. It's just almost funny because can you imagine a greater mess than that? I mean, Trump in any kind of a primary is like, what do we think that say they both ran and DeSantis won? What we think Trump is going to be like, well done, Ron. You have my support from here on out. Like, oh my God, it's going to be a bloodbath.
Yeah. And if you, yeah, no, it is very weird to think of Donald Trump needing to fight it out in any Republican context. I mean, my big takeaway from this week is not so much Trump and DeSantis, but with that cattle call they had out in Las Vegas,
Mm-hmm.
it's clear there are a lot of other Republicans saying, like, if it might not be Trump, it's not definitely going to be you, Ron. I want to run too. And you have this other dynamic where how much Trump can think strategically like this, I don't know. But the worst case for Trump is if it's Trump versus DeSantis. He wants it just to be Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's Trump versus DeSantis, he can lose that. But if it's Trump versus DeSantis and like 10 other people, Trump probably can win that. So I don't think, I mean, we're going to have a de facto shadow primary through 2023. And depending on how that turns out, you may not actually have a primary process. Like if Trump wins that, you may have it where he goes to, having already won it, he goes to Ronna McDaniel and says, you can hold some stuff, but we're just going to do this like we did it in 2020. But I don't think that is, at the moment, he clearly does not have the power to dictate like that. And I'm not so sure he's going to have it, because I think things are going to get, more complicated for Donald Trump, not less, both politically and legally. And obviously those things
Totally.
intersect.
I also think, say that this shadow primary persists, right? And there are serious doubts about Trump's staying power, I think what would be interesting is it would seem to behoove DeSantis in this situation to be the not Trump candidate, right? The Trump alternative. And obviously we know, and everyone who follows politics closely knows, that DeSantis is like just as, unhinged as Trump fundamentally. But Trump is also just staggeringly undisciplined. So it doesn't really take that much for someone to take those kind of ideas and package them into some more palatable package, which I think we would see DeSantis do in this situation. But the Trump problem would persist because Trump has got some, put a number on it, 30, 35, 40 at its height, maybe percent in his thrall. And that is not going to change because he particularly has a penchant for pulling out voters who don't usually vote, but who love Trump. And I think it's an enduring question. What would happen, and we saw this flurry of think pieces after the midterms of like Republicans grumbling it's time to throw Trump over. It's like, okay, yeah, we've experienced this a million times. Like this is now the third consecutive election where Trump has lost the Republican Party seats. We know that he is clearly an electoral liability, but he's also an electoral boon if you're a Republican, just by the uncomfortable fact that a good percentage of the base loves him in a way that they do not love other Republicans.
Right.
So that, I don't know how you resolve that either way.
Yeah. And the other, one question that people have asked, one way that people have framed this is, can DeSantis beat Trump in a head-to-head primary battle? And that is a very different question from, can he beat him in an 8-person, in a sort of a full thing. But can he beat him head-to-head? Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. I don't know how that shakes out, but that's not even really the question. The question is, will Donald Trump accept that? Will he say, wow, it was a tough fight, but you won, and now I'm just going to go back to being a normal retired president? I mean, yeah, right.
Off to paint some portraits.
Yeah, exactly. So either, one, I think, pretty obvious scenario is Trump runs as an independent and destroys Republicans everywhere. Or maybe he doesn't do that, but he just kind of like gets sullen and hangs out in Mar-a-Lago and just like craps on Ron DeSantis for the, for the next the last 6 months of 2024, in which case it will be almost impossible for DeSantis to win. So it's not, normally in most primary contexts, winning is enough, but it's not enough. And so they really have, Republicans have their work cut out for them. I think in some ways, the best case scenario for Republicans is maybe it goes really badly for Trump over the next 6 months. He's in legal trouble. He's blah, 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 blah. And it's like obvious he is not going to get nominated. It is not going to happen, like not even close. And so Trump kind of makes this decision. I don't want to be humiliated. So he says, oh, I never really wanted, I was just kind of, keeping the seat warm I never really wanted to run, and kind of he doesn't run and isn't doesn't need to be invested in the same way in destroying his Republican successor. That doesn't strike me as a terribly likely set of events, because like if things are going poorly for Trump, I think that just is going to make him hold on to the possibility of becoming president again even more tightly, because that's how he, recovers. That's how he defends himself legally and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, who knows how this is going to shake out? But it is a complicated set of factors for Republicans. Let's put it that way.
Yep.
Okay, well let's remind everybody the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off on your orders by using the promo code TPM. It's Grady'sColdBrew.com. And that's it for us this week.
All right. See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.